name is My name is Ellen Dunn. I'm a social worker and program coordinator with Alzheimer's Services. So thrilled to have you guys here today. I want to go ahead and just thank you all who have joined us for multiple days throughout this week. It's been a really successful and fun week, and thank you to all who are joining us here today too. So today we have a very special presentation, a very special presenter. I've been really looking forward to this one for a long time. So everybody gets to meet Ashley and get to know her a little bit more, like Christy and I have gotten to do over the past few months. So for the past 12 years, Ashley Stevens has utilized her gerontology background to provide support to caregivers throughout the state of North Carolina. Her story of dementia care began at a young age and continues today in her incredible work journey. You might be asking, how did dementia become her life? Isn't dementia for old people? Well, not quite. At the tender age of 6, Ashley was introduced to Alzheimer's disease as she watched it take a toll on her great-grandma Trolley. Decades later, as a millennial, Ashley has found herself organically in the midst of the dementia world, collaborating with families. It's not just a job for Ashley, it's her passion, her calling. Ashley holds a bachelor's degree in gerontology from Bowling Green State University, and she received her master's degree in social work from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her graduate certificate is focused on dementia care practices, aging, and global research. She also holds a professional license in social work and therapeutic practices. Ashley started the Dementia Guru caregiving blog and aging lifestyle platform to share her personal care journey, as well as offer other caregivers and millennials a space to connect, learn, and feel empowered. It is such an honor to have Ashley here today. Thank you so much. Y'all help me to welcome Ashley and take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ellen and Alzheimer's Services of the Capital Area team for having me and inviting me to this wonderful week of just great events and education and information for the Longest Day celebration and Alzheimer's awareness. I'm just so thrilled to be here with all of you and appreciate being invited to speak today. And thank all of you for joining me and taking time out of your very, very busy schedules. I know we're all so very busy, so I don't take it lightly that you took some time to join me today. So I want to get to know all of you as well. Where are you from? Where are you located? What's your name? Feel free to hop in the chat and let me know your name and where you're from. I want to get to know all of you as well. And as Ellen mentioned, I am in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm originally from Ohio, but I moved to Charlotte years ago, and I've been here for over 12 years now and working in the field of gerontology and social work and dementia care. So I am a gerontologist and a social worker. And at heart, I am just truly a caregiver advocate. I've worked in the field of aging for many years and just really sincerely believe that it is my calling. And like Ellen mentioned, Alzheimer's disease has impacted my family for many years, from my great-grandma Trolley when she was diagnosed and I was only 6 years old, to my paternal grandmother, my Nana. She was diagnosed with another form of dementia a few years ago. So I have really watched dementia take a toll on the ones that I truly love and care for, while also watching it take a toll on my family. I've watched it take an entire toll on my family dynamic and those that I love as well. At a young age, I watched my mom. She stepped into that role of a caregiver and became one of the primary caregivers for my grandma Trolley. And then me, as an adult, fast forward all these years later, me stepping into that role as a caregiver and supporting my family as we cared for my Nana. So it just really is my heart's mission to be able to continue this work and carry out the legacy of my grandmothers. So that's why I'm here today. And that's brought me to this field of gerontology, the field of dementia care, and the work that I do right now. I currently work with the state of North Carolina as a dementia practitioner. And it's a really cool program where we work with family caregivers day in and day out to kind of help them identify what their goals are as a caregiver, kind of help them understand the disease process and make sense of that, develop some coping skills. We provide them with respite funding so they can take a break because we know how important that is. And then also helping those caregivers begin to develop and set some healthy caregiver boundaries. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, how setting boundaries can impact your caregiver confidence. So our learning objectives for today are to understand, first we want to understand what are boundaries? What are they? Why are they important? What are the different types or categories of boundaries? Then we're going to identify what self-care is and the value that it brings to you as a caregiver. Next, we're going to learn the importance of setting boundaries for caregivers. Why is it so important to set those boundaries? And last, we're going to develop and commit to setting a personal caregiver boundary today. So we've got some actionable items. We're going to be engaged throughout this presentation. So if you have any questions or thoughts or comments while I'm chatting or going through anything, please be sure to type those into the chat or the comment section, and we will get to those closer to the end of the presentation. And I see some of you have already, I'm looking at the chat now, you've already added, oh goodness, okay, thank you for being with us. Anne is in Baton Rouge. Oh, Mary Ann, okay, Diane. Carol, all of you, thank you so much for joining me. And it looks like you're all in Baton Rouge, so I might have to take a little trip down there one day to visit. Or you could come visit in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's so nice. It's a pretty day here today. So thank you all for participating today and welcome. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, this is going to be a very engaging and interactive presentation. So first, what I need you to do, if you have access to your web browser, another web browser, if you could go into a new web browser and type in this address, it's www.poleev.com/AshSteve230. And like I said, you can either do that from a new web browser, or if you have a smartphone available, you can just type that in on your web browser. And that's the poll site that we're going to be using today to do a little poll. Okay, so you'll type that website into your browser, and then you can type in your name or skip. You don't have to put your name in, it's going to be anonymous, but these are the steps to get the poll activated. And let me make sure it's activated. Okay. And then what I want you to do is select an answer to the prompt. And the prompt is, I want you to raise your hand virtually if you have ever told someone no, and then immediately you felt guilty afterwards. Raise your hand virtually if you have ever told someone no and immediately felt guilty after telling someone no. And I'll give you a moment to finish that poll. Hopefully you're able to access that okay. Yes, and I see someone says, can we put the web address here? Yep, it's on the PowerPoint, but I am also going to put it here right now for you. poleev.com/AshSteve230. That's in the chat if you need a few more moments to access that poll. When you get there, I want you to respond to the prompt. Raise your hand if you have ever had to tell someone no, and then when you did, you felt guilty. I want to know how you felt. A few more seconds to give you some time to do that. Okay. So let's see what our responses are. Okay, there we are. Hands raised. 60% of you raised your hands. 10%, only 10% of you said no, never. So not too many of you. And then 30%, looks like 30% said, sometimes I feel kind of guilty having to say no. So the majority of us, 60% of us, we feel guilty after we have to tell somebody no. Myself included. So I didn't vote today, but my hand is raised, and I see Ellen, her hand is raised in the box as well. What is it about saying no that we just feel so guilty about? Why is that so difficult? And I'll be honest, like I said, my hand is raised, and sometimes I'm kind of shy. I'm a little bit shy sometimes. I think it's that shyness mixed with trying to be kind, also trying not to upset anybody, not wanting to hurt anybody's feelings. I would immediately feel guilty when I say no. I've gotten better over the years because now like I feel like I'm really strong in my boundaries and being able to say no. But I'll admit, years ago, saying no, I really felt bad afterwards. And then I would go back and try to undo it because I felt so bad. So why is that? Why do I feel that? Why do you all feel? 60% of us feel, oh, it's rising. 64 of us, 64% of us feel guilty when we have to say no. Is it that hard line in that sand that makes us feel like I didn't want to say that? Is it because it's just flat out no, there's no other explanation or response? It could be a couple of things, but I'm here today to tell you and to encourage you that there's no shame, there's no guilt in telling someone no. No can be a complete sentence, and no is a clear boundary. So let's get into it. What are boundaries? I like to think of boundaries as those little invisible barriers that really help us protect ourselves, regulate the contact and the interactions that we have in our relationships. So it's really important for us to establish these so that we can protect ourselves. We protect ourselves and we preserve what is valuable and important to us. With that, there are 3 different categories of personal boundaries. So this is usually defined by researchers and social workers. I'm a social worker, so a lot of my research is focused with other social workers and psychologists who have defined what the categories of boundaries look like. So the first type of boundary is a rigid boundary. With a rigid boundary, that type of boundary is very strict. There's little contact with any outside subsystems. And with this type of research that has been done on boundaries, they're really focusing and looking at family dynamics. They're looking at family systems and how we all operate within our families. So when it says subsystems and outside contact, it's looking at those factors that are outside of that family system that either are able to come into the family or disrupt the family, and that's based off of the boundary. So a rigid boundary is very strict, little contact with outside subsystems, and can lead to disengagement and isolation. So take a look at the PowerPoint screen, and you'll see this is an example. This line is a demonstration of a very strict, rigid boundary. When you look at it, it's pretty hard. Nothing can get through it. Nothing's going to penetrate that line. So it's a little too strict because it doesn't allow for any flexibility. The next boundary is a clear boundary. With a clear boundary, if you're able to set a clear boundary, you also are able to receive someone else's boundary. So when someone else tells you no, you're able to receive that and understand why. A clear boundary is healthy. It allows for some autonomy for the person, a little bit of independence, but it also is flexible in the sense where it allows for connection within our relationships and within those family subsystems that we talked about earlier. So a clear boundary, that line may look a little like this. So it's not as strict, it's not as rigid as the rigid line that we looked at from the rigid boundary. There's a little bit of flexibility. It allows for some flow of information and communication amongst those members in the family. The last type of boundary is a diffuse boundary. A diffuse boundary, sometimes if you do some research, some researchers call it porous, a porous boundary, meaning that anything can get into it. Anything can kind of permeate it or penetrate it or go through that boundary. This type of boundary can lead to enmeshment or blurred emotions within those family systems or family relationships. This type of boundary can lead to some pretty unhealthy dynamics between those in the family. So you don't want to have a diffuse boundary where anything can just come through. You're not really strong in what your needs and your values are, and anybody can disrupt your system. So that line may look a little bit like this. And as you can see, it's pretty spread out. So anything, like I mentioned, anything is going to get through that. There's no protection there. There's nothing there to kind of protect that system or that individual. So those are the three different types of boundaries: rigid, clear, and diffuse or porous. So let's see some examples of what that would actually look like coming into play. Meet Alexis. Alexis is a caregiver for her partner, Connie. Alexis recently had issues with Connie's sister, who has not been very supportive of Connie's care needs and her home care costs. That might sound familiar to some of you. Alexis has decided that she will no longer accept any calls or requests from Connie's sister and has blocked her number without any notice. This is an example of what type of boundary. If you were to just guess in your head really quick, what type of boundary is Alexis setting? Rigid, clear, or diffuse? Take a guess. Oh, I see somebody in the comments said rigid. Okay, you are correct. Alexis is setting a rigid boundary between her and Connie's sister. And it's rigid because it's super, super strict. It's a little bit too strict. There's no flexibility. Sounds like there's actually no communication about her needs and her values between Alexis and Connie's sister. She's just completely blocked her out. So what we know about rigid boundaries is that when you do that, it's going to lead to isolation. So Connie is going to be isolated. Alexis is going to be isolated. Connie's sister is going to feel isolated, even if she has kind of caused some of this. And it doesn't solve the issue. It doesn't solve the issue that Connie's sister is not being supportive to Connie or Alexis, who is her primary caregiver. So it's a little bit too rigid of a boundary. Okay, let's do another example. Meet Walter. Walter is caring for his 70-year-old wife who is living with Alzheimer's disease. Walter recently became upset when his wife asked him, "What's for dinner?" for the 12th time in 1 hour. That also sounds very familiar to me. Walter decided to tell his wife he is unable to answer her question again and redirects her to another activity. This is an example of what type of boundary. What type of boundary do you think Walter is setting? Is it a rigid boundary, a clear boundary, or a diffuse boundary? Take a second to guess. What do you think? Walter is setting a clear boundary between him and the dementia care this time. So this time, this is a unique boundary because it's not really a boundary that he's setting with someone else or with his wife, but he's really setting that boundary between him and the dementia, between him and the care that he's providing. It's a clear boundary because he also communicates using an I statement. So he said, I am unable to answer that question again at this time. And then, really clever, he decides to redirect his wife to a new activity rather than getting upset that she asked the same question over and over again. Now, I want to be clear. We all know that repetition, saying the same things over and over, that's very normal, very common in the realm of dementia. And it is also very common and very normal to be frustrated and even annoyed by having to have the same conversations multiple times with your loved one. That's okay if you get frustrated from time to time. Give yourself grace. Allow for those moments of frustration, and then recognize that this is the dementia talking. This is not my loved one. This is the dementia talking. And setting a clear boundary between you and the dementia, you and the dementia care that you're providing, that helps you to not flip out on your loved one while also maintaining a little bit of your peace of mind, which is really important. And of course, I'm not saying that setting boundaries is easy. Okay. I want to be clear about that too. Setting boundaries is hard work. It is daily work. It's a choice. It's a daily choice to be able to set a boundary and uphold and honor that boundary. And sometimes it doesn't always go the way that we planned because dementia doesn't always go the way we planned, and it throws us off of our tracks. And that's okay. But we still try, we still make an effort to set those boundaries. And the idea is really to find your boundary sweet spot. I like to call it your boundary sweet spot. So you want to land somewhere in the middle where your boundaries are clearly communicated and you're able to kind of enforce those healthy lines of protection for you and your loved one. And I love what psychotherapist Joyce Martyr says. When establishing a boundary, use assertive communication that is diplomatic, clear, honest, and respectful of yourself and others. And what I love so much about that is talking about respect for yourself. Boundaries is about respect for yourself. It's not just about everybody else. It's about respecting and taking care of yourself. She also suggests trying to speak in those I statements instead of you statements. So be clear about what you need as the caregiver and speaking in those I statements. So I value my time and my peace of mind. So I am unable to commit to that request today. That's an example of using an I statement. And Walter did really good with that. He said, I am unable to answer that question again. And then he redirected his wife. So you take on that accountability. You take on that control by using I statements. And practice. I'm going to say this a lot throughout this presentation. Practice, practice, practice. Practice in the mirror. Practice saying it out loud, getting comfortable with enforcing your boundary and what that sounds like and what that feels like. I like to do a lot of role playing with my clients. Sometimes that helps to actually talk it out with somebody else and role play it with somebody who you trust and practice how you would actually say or how you would actually set that boundary. But remember, it's finding that boundary sweet spot and landing in the middle where you are implementing a very clear and healthy boundary. And ultimately, it's about caring for yourself. It's about self-care. And so we're going to talk about that next. What is self-care? So I want you all to go back to your web browser. We're going to do one more poll if you will join me. You're going to go to your web browser and type in that website again, pollev.com/Ash Steve 230. And I will type that into the chat again, just in case we need it. pollev.com/Steve230. Once you get there, you shouldn't have to type in your name or anything again because you've already done that. So you can skip that part. And then I want you to respond to this question in one word. What does self-care mean to you? Because now we're talking about self-care. How do you define self-care in one word? If you could just put it all together in one word, what does self-care mean to you? And I'll give you just a few moments to get to that website and type in that response. What does self-care mean to you? All right. Let's see what we've got for our responses. Were you all able to access that? Hopefully.
Actually, it's just now coming up. I think I was getting the previous question, but now it seems to be working.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. A little lag time on the poll. Okay, so we'll give you a little bit more time to enter that in. What does self-care mean to you in one word? Oh, there goes my dog in the background. All right, I think we've got enough time. Let's see our results. Oh, beautiful. Let's see, we've got peace, time, staying healthy. Oh, love that one. Independence, getting rest, caring. Oh, I love this. Love, worth, absolutely. Balance. Oh, we're going to talk about balance. Awesome. Patience, worth, stress. Yes, because sometimes you need to have a self-care plan or regimen because you're so stressed, or it can be stressful trying to set a self-care plan in place. Let's see, in our chat, we've got some responses too. Agree, one word is hard. Oh, not feeling guilty when you say no. Exactly. And giving yourself permission to say no. Giving yourself that permission that this is what I value and this is what I'm sticking to. That's hard. Balance, patience, absolutely. Wow, you guys really captured it. And you did it in one word, but all of our words together really do help to define what self-care is. And of course, we all have our own definitions, but overall, self-care really does reflect these words that you all came up with. It's about enhancing our overall well-being and those activities that help us to be able to do that. Self-care allows us to manage and reduce stress. I know I saw stress in there, honor our emotional and our spiritual needs. And I like to kind of think of it as restoring our souls. Self-care allows us to do the things that are restorative to our souls. One of my favorite sayings is, be so filled up that you're able to pour out. Be filled up so that you can pour out. And it's the idea that we are not able to pour from an empty cup. Self-care allows us to fill up our cups and then be able to pour into someone else and for it to be of good use. So if you're not filled up, you're not adequately available to fill someone else up or to support someone. And that goes hand in hand with your loved one who you're caring for. If you're not filled up, if you're not at your best overall, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically, you're not going to be of any good service to your loved one or anyone else that you're caring for. So we really have to think about self-care as for us, but also for those that we love and that we care for. And this is critical for caregivers. I know right now, self-care is kind of a buzzword. It's a hot topic. But for family caregivers, it's critical. It's critical work. It's daily work. And it's not just a trend. It really is life-saving. And I always reflect back to, I facilitated African-American caregiver support group for dementia caregivers. And one of our group members, we saw this where she actually passed before her loved one. She passed away because of the stress, the toll that caregiving took on her. She was in and out of the hospital so many times. She put herself on the back burner. And we saw the effects, the negative effects that that had on her and her loved one and her family. And so I think about her and I get choked up because we miss her. She was a critical role in our support group. But when we talk about self-care, we mean it, right? It's not just a buzzword. It's not just a trend. It's really important for caregivers to implement self-care because it's life-saving. When you put yourself first, when you don't put yourself on the back burner, when you do those things that are meaningful and restorative to your soul, that adds value to your loved one. It adds value to the other relationships that you have as well. So let's look at some of those self-care activities and what that might actually look like. Self-care could be learning when to say no. And as we've been talking about thus far, learning to say no and not feel guilty about it, right? Exercising your will to reserve your energy, not getting to the place of burnout. Self-care looks like being self-aware of your limits, engaging in activities that develop your self-efficacy. And it's important to note that self-care activities are not just simple feel-goods, right? So it is nice to get your nails done, get your hair done. Those can be self-care activities, don't get me wrong. But self-care is also way more deeper than that. It's not just feel-good activities. It's also some of the activities that maybe they're not our most favorite, but they add value to our overall well-being, our overall mental capacity, emotional space. So sometimes those activities may not be our most favorite, but in the end, they add to our well-being. And so let's look at what some of those actual activities are. One example, taking a walk around the neighborhood when dementia gets too tough. Has anybody ever experienced that or needed to do that? Kind of take a break in the middle of a moment, having a moment. Physical exercise, that's another example. So that's kind of, for me, that's an example of, okay, it's not my most favorite activity, but it adds to my overall well-being because, well, I want to be healthy. I want to have longevity in my life. I want to be around for my family and my loved ones. So exercise is not my favorite, but it does contribute to my overall well-being. And it's something I value. I value my health. So I have to do that. Another example or activity would be taking respite, taking a break from the care that you provide, hiring someone to actually come into the home and relieve you of that 24/7 care. That's a great self-care activity. And like I mentioned before, the program that I currently work in, that's what we do. We provide that funding for those caregivers to be able to take a short-term break from the care. And within that break, you do something that is restorative to you, that is of value to you. So it's not just, you know, sitting around, it's doing something that makes you feel good about yourself on the inside. So if that's going to get your nails done, or going to get some exercise, or going to meet and socialize with friends that you haven't seen in a year because of dementia, plan that within your respite time. Plan that within your self-care routine, okay? Another example, carving out specific time to handle business, such as finances, care planning. Maybe you have family care planning meetings that you need to discuss or plan. That's self-care, because you're carving out that specific time to be able to accomplish that and have all those needs and goals met with your family members. That can be a part of your self-care routine. Another one, attending a support group or speaking with a therapist. I think that those self-care activities are so critical. I really hope that you all are connected to a support group in some way, where you can get around other family caregivers who just get it. They get it. They know, they've experienced it. They can help you work through some of those difficult days and challenging moments. Or even speaking with a licensed therapist, a trained counselor who can help create space for you to talk through those challenging things, or talk through, how do I set a self-care plan or regimen? How do I even begin to think about that? A therapist can really create space and time for you to think through that and put that into action. So these are just a few examples. And of course, self-care is going to look very different for all of us, but it's very important that you begin to think about how that looks for you. And just going into the chat real quick, let's see. Someone said, yep. Mabel said, yep, it's a must for me. Watch TV shows that make me laugh. Oh, I love that. That's perfect, because laughter is also healing to the soul. I love a good laugh. I may tell some jokes that are not so funny, but they're funny to me and make me laugh. And that helps to lighten my mood and make me feel better. 10 minutes of journaling also helps. Absolutely. Journaling is so therapeutic. If you've got a journal, definitely have a caregiving journal where you can talk about the challenges, talk about the joys of caregiving, the unique blessings that you experience as a caregiver. You can also note down in that journal some of the changes and things you're seeing in yourself, or that you're seeing in your loved one. That also helps you when you're going to the doctor's appointment. You whip out that journal, you're able to kind of recount some of the things that have happened over the last 6 months. So journaling is a great resource for caregivers. And yes, laughter is good for the soul. Gardening when it's not too hot out, absolutely. Getting out, getting your hands into the soil, getting your hands into the earth. I also like to think of grounding techniques, grounding activities, which involve connecting to the earth. So it could be that gardening. It could just be going outside, standing in the grass, planting your feet down for 10 solid minutes and centering your thoughts, meditating, taking deep breaths in and out, feeling the ground beneath you, calling to your senses as you're doing that. That's what grounding is. I love grounding. So thank you, Deb McMillan, for mentioning that, because that's self-care right there. And it definitely helps in those moments of, challenging dementia days or moments, or behavioral symptoms pop up. You need a moment to yourself. Grounding and gardening, getting outside, fresh air, that helps to kind of bring you back to your center. So great. Thank you for that. All right. So you might be saying, okay, Ashley, this all sounds good, but why? Like, why do we have to set boundaries, and why do we need to implement self-care? Is it that important? And I believe it is. I'm here to tell you that I believe that it really is. It adds value to your entire well-being. There was a research study by Johns Hopkins University. Their School of Nursing did a really unique research study, and they found that caregivers who considered their own needs and the person with dementia needs when making decisions and setting limits on their caregiving commitments and personal sacrifices, those caregivers fulfilled their own care needs. There were 3 emerging trends that came out from that research study. The first was self-care needs of the caregiver and how important that is. The enablers of self-care. So how do we actually enable self-care? What helps us to actually be able to implement self-care? And then the last thing they found was the barriers to self-care, because there are oftentimes, I think somebody actually typed in that word, there are sometimes those barriers to being able to set a self-care routine in place. And someone else had mentioned about the difficulty of actually balancing self-care, balancing your role as a caregiver, balancing your role in the professional realm if you're also a parent, balancing the role of your family and parenting, raising a family. You've got all of these different roles that you're trying to balance, and it can be very difficult. The researchers identified the importance of caregivers caring for themselves in order to enable the care for the person living with dementia. They found that this empowers the caregiver to engage in self-care behaviors and adequately meet their own needs. And that can then in turn lead to caregiver empowerment, that confidence we're talking about. When you're able to enact and enable that self-care routine, that can lead to you feeling more confident, more stronger, more empowered in your caregiver role, which then adds to your overall well-being. And what I found really interesting in this study, there was a point where they said, caregivers will need to learn to reposition themselves by separating their caregiver roles from their personal roles to avoid negative caregiving effects and to enable self-care. When I heard that and I read that, I had to read it again because I'm like, reposition themselves. How are they going to do that? Because you know, you're in the thick of it. And you, like I said, you've got all these different roles that you're trying to balance and manage. But they're saying you have to be able to reposition yourself and separate some of those roles from time to time to avoid the negative caregiving effects on you and your loved one. So self-care is not just for you. It's for your loved one too. That's the point we're trying to make here too. Setting boundaries, practicing self-care, it's good for you, but it's also good for your loved one. Your loved one benefits as well when you're able to set those roles, when you're able to set limits. And that, my friends, is what we call a boundary. When you're setting limits, you're setting a distinction between your roles, that's a boundary. Being able to do that is a boundary. And not saying that you always will be able to do that and that it's also easy, because sometimes those roles are blurred and sometimes they are connected, and that's okay. But the more that you are able to identify when it is time to kind of not blur those lines and separate those roles and set up those boundaries, that's going to add to your overall self-efficacy. And when we think about self-efficacy, that's all about your confidence and your ability to control and control your motivation about yourself, about those around you, about your environment. So doing these things we're talking about, setting boundaries, implementing self-care, that adds to your self-efficacy and your motivation and your confidence, okay? And you'll see when you set boundaries, you empower yourself. You're able to have more intentional relationships. This is my favorite one. Dementia cannot control your entire life because it will try, but you have to be the one to say, nope, not today. It's not going to take over. It's not going to take over my mental space. It's not going to take over all of my emotions. And like we said before, it's protection for you and your loved one, which is critical. And I will say it also strengthens the bond and the relationship and the family dynamics of your family. I always think about my mom because, like I mentioned more recently, about 2 years ago, she actually stepped into the full-time caregiving role for my grandmother. And she would always say to me, I never knew our bond and our relationship could get even stronger, even better, because they were already really tight, really close. But through that caregiving, their bond became closer. And then me being involved in the care, that strengthened 3 generations of our family dynamics and that bond. And I just truly just appreciated watching my mom step into that role, watching the relationship between my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother, she passed this past January, but I always carry that in my heart because I watched how critical that relationship and that caregiving role really was, and seeing my mom be able to step up into that role, but also taking the time to set aside for herself, implementing a little bit of self-care, setting those boundaries. That also strengthened the relationship between her and my grandmother. Okay, so here's the part, my favorite part, where we're going to actually talk about how do we commit to setting a personal caregiver boundary. Sounds good, but how do we actually do it? How will you hold yourself accountable to when you're setting your own personal boundary? So I want us to take a little bit of a moment to think about what that looks like for you. And you can kind of just think about this in your mind, or if you have a pen and paper, feel free to jot it down. But this is kind of a free-flowing activity where I want you to think about what this may look like for you. And I'm going to walk you through that. So first, you want to think about what is valuable to you as a caregiver. What is valuable to you as a caregiver? Is it preserving your energy? Is it spending quality time and socializing with your friends and family? Is that really important to you? It could be getting plenty of sleep and feeling rested. That's a good value to have. Think about those things that you value and that you need as a person, as a caregiver. I have a caregiver that I work with for many years, and I think of her because she always would say, I value my sleep. I value my rest. And she was actually caring for both her parents living with dementia in the home. So that may be familiar to you, or just kind of try to imagine how difficult that is, trying to balance 2 individuals living with dementia in the home by yourself. And so that really disrupted her sleep routine and her sleep regimen. And I remember her saying, I need at least 7 to 8 hours a night. Like, that was really important for her. So we really were intentional about, okay, how can we use this respite, this funding for respite, to be able to allow you to get that rest? Or if you lost the rest the night before or a couple of nights before, how do you recoup that with having someone come into the home and give you that relief? So that was a value for that caregiver. And it may be a value for you, but think about what that is, what's valuable to you, and keep that in mind. Then I want you to think about what's valuable to your loved one, because that's important too. Is it that they receive quality care? Is safety and security maybe valuable to your loved one? Maybe it's just having a really good care team in place. Maybe you guys had that conversation prior to the dementia diagnosis, and you know that that's really important to them. Keep those things in mind too, because that's going to help you frame your boundaries. Then I want you to hold space for those values. So if getting rest, like the caregiver I mentioned, if getting rest is valuable to you, then honor that and create space for that value. That's how you're going to begin to set the boundary around that. You're going to set the boundary around needing to get that rest, needing to get your full 7 to 8 hours of sleep at night. Okay, so now let's get more specific, because we know that we can't just talk about these things. We have to actually get very specific about them. That way we can actually be more successful in attaining that boundary and achieving that boundary or that goal. So I want you to think of one specific caregiver boundary you can commit to today. So an example could be, I will commit to saying no when I am at my capacity and I feel like I'm running on empty. That could be a hard and fast boundary that you want to set. So if that's your boundary, now you gotta kind of start thinking about, okay, how specifically am I gonna enforce that? What exactly am I gonna say when somebody comes up to me and challenges me on that? So you might say, I'm not able to do that for you today. I'm at my capacity, period. Leave it there. Or you could say my favorite, no. Because remember, no is a complete sentence. We've decided that today. And if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, please remember that no is a complete sentence, and that saying no, there's no shame, there's no guilt in that. It's a form of protection for yourself and your loved one, and it's a boundary. Now, after you've decided what your boundary is and what that is for you, how confident do you feel? I really want you to think about how confident do I feel that I'm going to be able to actually carry this out, because that really makes it or breaks it, if you feel confident or not. And you want to land somewhere around a 7. A 7 is a good place to be. If you aren't at a 7 of confidence, which is on the higher end of very confident, then that's okay. We just have to adjust the boundary, or we have to adjust how we are going to enforce the boundary. Okay. So if you start out feeling at a 5, that's okay. We adjust the boundary so that we get somewhere around here where we feel more confident in being able to say that boundary and enforce that boundary. And the only way we're going to get confident is by practicing, which we talked about earlier. Practice, 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 so that we can gain that confidence. Practice how you will actually say it. Do it in the mirror. See how it feels. May kind of feel funny, and that's okay. I don't mind when I feel funny. I know I feel funny a lot of times, but I still do it anyways. So just try it. Give it a try and practice it with someone you trust. Maybe the role playing that we talked about earlier. This is a great activity if you want to try this with your support group, or if you want to try this with your therapist. That's a great activity to do with your therapist. And then you come back and you reassess. You assess and see, how did I do? How did I feel? That didn't feel good. I didn't like that. So then you adjust it. But just remember, you continue to practice so that you can kind of build that up and you can gain that confidence. And I'll use myself as an example, because I'm always setting boundaries. My friends, they call me the boundary queen. I've now taken on that title, the boundary queen, because I really believe in this for everyone. We have to have healthy, clear boundaries. And I think back to when I worked in memory care. I worked in a memory care community and neighborhood for many years, working with our residents living with dementia and their caregivers, training staff, developing programming. Oh, I love that job. I love that role so much. But it was, I'll be honest, it was hard many days. I'm sure you can relate. Some days were just really tough. And I remember this one time, one of my residents, she was just having a very difficult day. And I was trying to help her with care. We were in the back area in the bathing area, and she just was not having it with me. And she kind of charged at me. She had a glass of water, threw it in my face. And I'm standing there like in shock, like, oh gosh, what just happened? What did I do? What could I have done differently? I'm just in complete shock. And in that moment, I just said, okay, that took me for a surprise. I need to take a break. And she kind of looked at me like, okay, sweetheart. Like, I don't even think she even remembered, which was fine. But for me, I felt so shocked. I felt icky in that moment. I didn't know what I did to cause that. So immediately I set a quick boundary, very quick. I distanced myself from the care I was providing, from the dementia. I went out back to our courtyard. I took 10 laps. I took 10 very deep breaths. And then I reassessed what happened there? What did I upset her? How can I make sure that she's okay? And then making sure that I'm okay. So that was a moment where in that, very shocking incident, I had to set a very quick boundary. And I kind of carried that on with me throughout the course of all the work that I've done. I worked at the Alzheimer's Association on the 24-hour helpline. And you can imagine that's a lot of crisis calls that you're receiving day in and day out. And I took that same kind of boundary that I had set earlier about, okay, sometimes when you're done with a call, you're done with a difficult dementia event or incident, you got to take a step back. You got to walk around the building. You got to take 10 deep breaths so that you're able to get back into the game. And that's a boundary that I set for myself and that I still abide by to this day. So I use that example of myself because I'm trying to lead by example. And I want you all to think about what that boundary is going to look like for you. Take a few moments to really be intentional about that and practice enforcing that. And to help you, I've developed something for you, a very special gift for you. It is your very own boundaries workbook. And this is just really a guide to continue on what we've talked about today, how to begin to set that boundary, what that might be for you, identify your values as a caregiver, and practice implementing that boundary. And so Ellen is going to share that with you. She's going to send that to you at the end of this presentation. My gift to you, and I want to encourage you that it's good work. It's tough work, but it's good work. And as you're doing that, if you have any questions, please reach out, utilize me as a resource, as your boundaries queen, as my friends like to call me. But that's a gift to you, and we'll be sending that to you. So we've covered all of our learning objectives. We talked about boundaries, self-care, why those things are so important to caregivers. We're making a commitment today to setting our own boundaries, and we're developing our confidence. So thank you all for joining me today. I've left a little bit of time, and we've got hopefully a little bit more time to answer questions. I know we've probably got some in the chat, so Ellen can talk about that, and hopefully we can answer those for you. But if we don't get to them, here's my contact information. So feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you, Ashley. That was an incredible presentation. Such an important topic to talk about. And I feel like everything you spoke about just resonates with every single one of us here today. So thank you so much for taking the time to share.
You're welcome.
We do have a couple of questions now. Just so everybody knows, I will share that workbook like Ashley said, but I will also send out her contact information as well, so that if you have any questions for her afterwards. But Miss Donna did ask, when you were mentioning roles and boundaries as far as your role, can you talk a little bit about how do you separate the different roles that maybe a caregiver works with?
Yes, now that's a great question. Thank you, Donna. It's tough to separate those roles. And like I mentioned before, sometimes those roles, they do connect together, and you don't always have to separate them. But to be able to separate them, I think sometimes that calls on being able to lean on your support network and being able to do exactly what we're talking about, take that respite time for yourself and being able to say, okay, I'm getting a little bit too into the thick of this role, or I'm seeing that this role is kind of merging with this. It's not a healthy relationship, or I'm feeling like dementia is taking over and I'm getting more upset with my loved one. I'm raising my voice with my loved one. I'm more frustrated. I'm feeling burnt out. When you start to feel those kind of telltale signs of stress and indicators of, okay, I'm burning out at this point. That's when you know, okay, I've got to separate the roles. And to do that, I think that's when we rely on our support network. We rely on our informal support networks, but we also rely on our formal support networks. So if we don't have a lot of family and friends around us, then we tap into those local resources that might be available to give us respite and support us. So that could be the support group, that could be a respite grant program like the one I mentioned earlier that I work with. It could be a program through the Department of Social Services where maybe they have in-home aid or some type of service or program that gives you relief and gives you respite so that you are able to take a step back from those roles and be able to separate them.
Thank you, Ashley. I have another question as well. I know you addressed I statements a little bit, and you gave a couple of examples. Can you give a few more examples of maybe some powerful I statements that can be used for boundaries?
Yes. So, and to go back about what I statements are, it's really that you taking that control, you taking that accountability. So being able to say, I deserve to experience my life in the way that I want to. Or I think about a really important thing that happens for caregivers where you kind of, you lose some of your own dreams and your own visions and your own goals for yourself. So a really good example of an I statement for that would be, I value the dreams and the goals and the aspirations that I have for my life that I haven't had a chance to enjoy or take time out for. I value that, and I have to take time for myself. I have to set that goal. That is important to me. So because of that, I am not going to be able to commit to this, or I am not going to be able to say yes to every request that you have of me, because I'm focused on my goals and I'm focused on my loved one, and that's all I'm creating space for. Another one is just being able to, I kind of think about one of my other caregivers who, when she was setting one of her boundaries, it was, and I think I might have had this on the presentation, but her boundary was, I cannot stand when all of my friends and family, they call me in the evening time and they ask all these questions about how mom's doing, what did mom do today? Nobody's thinking about me. Nobody cares about me. And I don't want to just have to always report out. Like it's exhausting because then she's having to also relive the day. And they were doing this every single day. So a good boundary for her was saying, okay, after 7 p.m., I'm not taking on those kind of calls. Or if I do take on the call, the way she enforced the boundary was using I statements and saying, I am not going to be able to answer any dementia or disease related questions for you past 6 p.m. Do not call me with those types of questions. If you have those questions, ask them at 12 p.m., ask them at 2 p.m., but I'm not doing it at 10 p.m. at night. I'm just not doing it. And if you have an issue with that, then you don't call. And she had to really enforce that boundary. So I love that example because it's using those I statements. It's not that you call me past 10, you call me too late in the evening, I can't stand when you call me. It's more so her taking that accountability. I don't appreciate receiving these calls. I am not able to receive that. I am at capacity. And so because of that, I will not be taking on your calls. Those are good I statements.
Thank you so much. That can definitely be so empowering. And I appreciate you sharing some really nice, realistic examples that any of us can use. So we are a little bit over on time, Ashley. So I just want to thank you again for a fabulous presentation. I want to thank everybody too who participated in the chat with Ashley. It was such an awesome experience to see everybody's comments and questions and things. And thank you all to who's joined us throughout the week as well, and to our sponsors too. We can't wait to see y'all again in the future. And again, thank you, Ashley. This was wonderful.
Yes, thank you all. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.